Good morning, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you in person and online to our 2025 Gender Conference titled Gender and AI, Promises and Perils, and co-sponsored by the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. Our program began yesterday evening with an opening event on how artistic expression offers unique insight into the intersection between gender and artificial intelligence, or AI. Today, we'll continue our exploration of this intersection through a series of sessions on various aspects of AI, from the technical to the societal and political. In recent years, advances in AI have dominated headlines and discourse, generating both excitement and trepidation. Already, AI-based technologies are increasingly a part of everyday life, from email spam filters to driver assist technologies in cars to chatbots that use generative AI to produce texts and images. Just 2 years after the widely publicized release of ChatGPT, nearly 40% of US adults aged 18 to 64 reported using generative AI to some extent, according to a 2024 study by Harvard's David Deming and his colleagues. That means, the author wrote, that generative AI's adoption rate already exceeds that of the personal computer and the internet at comparable points in time. And as we'll hear today, current and potential applications of AI extend far beyond familiar uses like help drafting an email, as important as that can be. They include such wide-ranging domains as medicine, education, human resources, law, and as yesterday's program illustrated, the arts. As this technology develops, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and the public are grappling with both its promises and its risks. Indeed, emerging AI capabilities and applications bring with them important questions about their potentially dramatic impacts, whether beneficial or harmful. They raise economic considerations like effects on productivity and the workforce, and policy questions about how best to harness AI's possibilities while mitigating its potential harms. They also spark profound philosophical questions about debates about intelligence and what it means to be human. And they raise important ethical considerations regarding privacy, transparency, fairness, and AI's capacity to both perpetuate and address societal biases. Today's convening will consider challenges and opportunities in AI, specifically as it intersects with gender. We'll hear from computer scientists, engineers, policymakers, ethicists, and other practitioners as they consider how gender may affect, positively and negatively, the creation, operation, and impact of cutting-edge AI-driven technologies. Now, let me provide an overview of our program. We'll begin with remarks by the conference's faculty organizers, Iris Bohnet and Fernanda Villegas. In just a moment, I'll introduce Iris, who will offer a brief welcome on behalf of the Women in Public Policy program. Then Fernanda, Sally Starving-Seaver Professor at Radcliffe and Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at Harvard's Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, will set the stage for today's discussions with a brief primer on artificial intelligence. After Fernanda's remarks, we'll hear our first session of the day focus on gender and inputs used to produce AI. Next, our second session will turn to outputs, as our speakers will consider applications of AI in wide-ranging fields of study and practice, such as health and criminal law. Our third session will then examine policy and advocacy, after which we'll have a short break. If you're attending in person, lunch will be available downstairs in the Coolidge Room for you to bring back and enjoy during our keynote program. Our keynote will feature Rana El Kayoubi, AI scientist, co-founder, and general partner of Blue Tulip Ventures and host of the Pioneers of AI podcast. After the keynote, Iris will offer closing remarks to conclude our convening. We welcome your thoughts throughout the program. Whether you're watching in person or online, you can submit questions using the Slido link provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. The moderator and speakers in each session will address as many questions as they can. We'll start our program in just a moment, but first, let me offer some thanks. I'm grateful to the Women in Public Policy program for co-sponsoring this convening. I'd also like to thank Iris Bohnet and Fernanda Villegas for their work developing today's program, as well as many people across the university who shared their insights and expertise with us as this conference took shape. Thank you as well to Rebecca Wasserman, Executive Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Radcliffe, Jessica Ficklin, Director of Events, and their entire teams. I'm also grateful to acknowledge the Perrin Moorhead Grayson and Bruns Grayson Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event, as well as members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programs free and open to the public, and we thank you. Finally, I'm grateful to today's distinguished group of speakers and moderators and to everyone in our virtual and in-person audience for joining us. Thank you to you all. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Iris Bohnet. Iris is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and co-director of the Women in Public Policy program, both at Harvard Kennedy School, as well as director of the Social Sciences program here at Radcliffe. A distinguished behavioral economist, Iris combines insights from economics and psychology to improve decision-making in organizations and society, often with a gender or cross-cultural perspective. She is the award-winning author of the book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, and co-author of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, which was released this year. Iris advises governments and companies on gender equity around the world, and in 2021, she was appointed to the Gender Equality Advisory Council of the G7. Now, please join me in warmly welcoming Iris to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It is so lovely to see so many of you here today. Thank you for coming back, and those of you who couldn't join us yesterday, thank you for joining us today. First, let me thank the Dean, Brown-Negin, so much for supporting this conference. It is really her leadership here at Radcliffe that makes many of these programs, including this one, possible. Thank you so much for your commitment to advancing the causes that we all care so much about. So I'm incredibly excited about this day, and I am honored to represent the Women in Public Policy program here, which is delighted to be co-sponsoring with Radcliffe in a really tiny way. I just told Becky we get too much credit for what is happening here, but we're very happy to be partners. So I thought I'm going to quickly offer some remarks about yesterday and then turn it over to Fernanda. So first of all, those of you who were here yesterday will remember Anna's work on irises, and you know that's my first name. So I thought I'm going to start with a self-servingly biased remark on how meaningful that work is to me. But it kind of lends itself to the bigger question of the biases, of course, that we all hold, and that is a topic that we will definitely talk about today. My second observation is maybe a bit of a guiding principle for us today that Stephanie offered. So Stephanie had a slide up that said, our systems must be nurtured to understand communities as the communities understand themselves. And I found that statement very touching and very inclusive in all possible ways. And so I hope we can not just nurture our systems, that's obviously very important, but also nurture each other today as we are in community. And with that, I am delighted to welcome back Professor Fernanda Viegas, who I have had the pleasure of working with this year. We did not know each other beforehand, but have become friends very quickly. It's been such a pleasure working with you, and thank you to Becky as well for this very fun collaboration. Professor Viegas, as the Dean just mentioned, will give us a bit of a primer on computer science. Please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is so exciting. And as Ira said, I have the small and easy task to tell you about AI in 10 minutes. So here we go. All right. So what is special about current AI? I like to contrast this to what came before. So before AI, when we did, traditional programming, and by the way, we still do a lot of traditional programming, we would have to tell the computer every single rule it would have to know to solve a problem. So computer, if you see scenario A, do this. If you see scenario B, do that, okay? In contrast, when we do AI programming, we don't tell computers the rules. We don't. We just show the computer lots and lots of examples. That's the training data, okay? And we just say, try to figure this out. So I show it cats, I show it dogs, and eventually I'm like, you figure it out now. Is this a cat or a dog? I showed you tons of examples, okay? The computer creates the rules themselves. The systems create the rules to figure that out themselves. And herein lies the crux of our situation. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because I don't have to be smart enough to tell the computer how to solve very difficult problems. For instance, I don't know how to diagnose cancer. I don't know everything there is to know about cancers or earthquakes or other things we haven't figured out yet, right? But maybe the computer, looking at tons and tons of cancer patients or earthquake data, can figure out something I haven't been able to figure out yet, okay? So that is the blessing part of this. The curse is that in doing so, I don't know exactly what the rules are that the computer figured out to solve that problem, and sometimes that can get us into deep trouble, okay? So let's look at one very simple example that you all, if you have email, you have used this. Spam filters. They work in the background. Nobody, if it's working well, you don't even think about it. If it's not working well, you will definitely be thinking about your spam filter. But let me assure you, your spam filter today uses machine learning, okay? What is the difference? Well, before machine learning, we would have to tell the computer every rule for what makes a spam email. So I would do things like, oh, if the new message contains the word credit card, mark it as spam. If the other message contains the word offer, mark it as spam, and so on and so forth. I would have hundreds of thousands of these rules. Great. Except that spam creators are very creative. And so they're going to create a whole new set of spam messages that I hadn't thought about before. So now I have to go back and update my really long list of rules. You can also imagine the other way around. Well, maybe I do get an email message that has the word offer that is actually a legitimate email. And I want to see that email, right? So it's brittle. It's not very robust. Let's think about machine learning now. Again, I do not give it the rules, but I give it 2 piles of lots and lots of email messages. One of these piles, I have labeled manually, and I have said, these are legitimate email messages. They are real. They're the good guys, okay? This other pile here, these are spam messages. I've labeled them, okay? And so these are the ones we want to not let pass through. And I show millions and millions of these things. And the computer is looking at these and is trying to find patterns. And then at some point I say, oh, here's a new message you've never seen before. Which one of these two piles does it look like? Okay? And then the computer is going to have to decide if it's spam or not spam. So my model learns patterns from labeled emails before, okay? And we keep saying model. What is a model? A model is a mathematical representation of these patterns, of these piles of things that I'm interested in. So we're gonna turn all of these piles of emails into math, okay? I'm gonna wave my hands and not explain how we do this, but think about it, we're gonna turn into numbers. And when I turn things into numbers, I can easily compare them. All right, this is all in good, Fernanda. You show me about spam filters. That's great. I have two categories, spam, not spam. But now let's talk about things like ChatGPT. That's so much more complex and nuanced, right? Like language is not super categorical. So what is happening there? Okay. So very briefly, when we look at language, when these large language models look and try to understand language, one of the basic things they're trying to do is I pick a word. So let's say in this example here, my word is work. And I'm gonna show this word within sentences to my model. All the sentences you can think of that have the word work in them, okay? Now think about this at the scale of the internet. Imagine all the bazillion times the word work has come up on the internet. I'm gonna look at those sentences, and then I'm going to start paying attention to the words that show up next to the word work. I really care about those words, okay? After I do that many, many, many times, this is my training data, by the way, I'm going to come out with a list of words that show up next to my target, which in this case is work. And I have a list of likely words, so the friends my word likes to hang out with, and the blue words, those are the yellow words. The blue words are words that work does not hang out with very much, okay? So now I have a list. I'm starting to create a list of likely neighbors to the word I care about, and unlikely neighbors, okay? Again, I do this at the internet scale, and I end up with a much, 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 much longer list of words that co-occur with my target word. This is, I'm calling it the profile of the word, okay? It's like kind of the neighborhood it likes to hang out in. These are word embeddings. So I have word embeddings for my word work. I also have word embeddings for every single word in the language I am looking at, okay? So now that I have these communities of words, I'm starting to understand how a word like tree or love might be different from a word like work. I actually, you know how we say it takes a village to raise a kid? It takes a village of words to understand the context for a single word, okay? And once I have this list, I start to see interesting nuances in language. I start to see things like, think about this list for the word bank. I'm gonna see it in terms of financial institutions, so those words are going to pop up, but they're also going to pop up words that have to do with river, a riverbank, right? So I start to capture multiple meanings of that word all in this list, okay? And once I have these lists for every single word, I then start to cluster them. I say, oh, look over here. Oh, okay, in the middle there, I have words like walk and swim and run. And oh, those networks of word are kind of similar. They're not the same, but they're hanging out in the same area. The words at the top right there, train and bus and car, guess what? the networks for those words also are kind of similar. They're starting to hang out in the same place, okay? And this is how I start to turn language into math, okay? This is how, you know, when you do a brainstorming exercise and you have to put Post-it notes, it's kind of like, imagine these are your Post-it notes. Okay, so these are rich, very rich representations of language. Sounds great. Are we done? Not quite. I have problems that come up here. Think about the word woman. Think about the word man. I have different neighborhoods of those words, and what does it mean if the word woman ends up hanging out closer to words like nurse and teacher versus the other word, man, hanging out closer to words like engineer and pilot, right? That's where this geometry here is where we start to see bias pop up, okay? And so there's a lot of power in literally just looking at what words concur with others and how do you autocomplete things. So when I say Cancun's located in the country of, I'm talking about geography. French word for computer is, my machine learning is gonna have to start translating. When I give it a sentence like this that it probably has never seen before, it's going to start to do math. So there is a lot of power. When I give it something like this, and I say, what is the next word? This is literally what ChatGPT is doing. It's going to have to go back and start to think in terms of Python code. When I give it something like this, women are. How do you complete this sentence, right? Women are what? But we are asking these systems to answer that, right? So that's where we need to start being careful, right? Because these systems will, again, answer in terms of that geometry I was telling you about. So autocomplete, as simple as it sounds, it's incredibly powerful. Everything rests on the data we feed it. So if we feed it very biased data, we're gonna get very biased systems to come out, right? And so we need to really understand the internals of these systems. That's a lot of the work that I do. And so a lot of what people like me do is actually look inside these spaces and try to understand how can we move, how can we understand what are the relationships here so that we can better address what's happening inside these systems. All right, so that was our super fast primer on AI. Hopefully you got some of that and stays with you. And now it's my pleasure to welcome my very dear colleagues, Finale Doshi-Velez and Catherine D'Ignazio, to the stage for the first session. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So we're very excited for this first panel. It's already been such a great morning. I've learned so much machine learning, Fernanda. Thank you. So the first panel for this morning, we're going to be talking about inputs to machine learning and AI models. And we've already heard a little bit about how these models take whatever they see in the world as their starting point, like, for example, all of the data on the internet. And I think we've all heard various versions of these stories. We've heard about how hiring algorithms have been biased because if historically there's been bias in hiring, you put in that biased data, the algorithm learns to replicate exactly that bias back out to you. Credit scoring algorithms have been biased. Patient severity scores have been biased. And all of these biases have come from basically replicating things that we see in the world, which is biased, back into our algorithms. Because as Fernanda said, these algorithms are basically taking the information and learning the rules themselves. We are not telling them the rules. they're learning the rules on their own. In the age of machine learning, or more powerful models, we were just talking about at breakfast. You ask for women painting, and you get women in paintings rather than women doing paintings. I had a very high blush moment with my role-playing group when I asked for a picture of a female elf in a forest, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to specify with clothes, right? These things happen, right? So I think we've all had these sorts of experiences, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. But what we really wanted to focus this discussion on is that we feel like I think we kind of get that garbage in, garbage out, right? If the data have problems, the model will have problems. And these are sort of things that people like me, people who are engineers, are working to solve, right? These are choices that we make when we make the algorithms. We can adjust them. There are entire conferences that work on, if the data have certain biases, how do we still make the models such that they'll behave themselves in various ways? But there's a broader issue here when it comes to inputs, and that is the question of how we are defining the problems in the first place. What are what we call the structural inputs that go into the design of this problem? So I'm very excited to have two amazing panelists today to speak on those issues. We have Catherine D'Ignacio, Associate Professor in Urban Science and Planning at MIT and Director of the Data plus Feminism Lab. And wait, okay, I'm just making sure you're on the screen. Margaret Mitchell, Chief Data Ethics Scientist at Hugging Face. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Let's give them a warm welcome. So I'd like to get this discussion. I very briefly mentioned this idea of structural inputs. Catherine, this was your term. Do you want to just define for us what you think of as structural inputs?
Sure, thank you. And just a huge thank you to the organizers and conceptualizers of this conference. I think it's an amazing and important event, and I'm glad we're doing it, and I'm glad we're doing it right now, and it's an honor to be here with you all. So yeah, thinking about structural inputs. So first of all, what Finale was talking about in terms of the data biases, like the data inputs, it's a huge problem, right? It's also an unsolved problem. Like we have ideas for how to solve it, and it still hasn't been solved. The models haven't changed. One of the things I talk about in relation to that specific problem is how machine learning and AI generally operate as status quo machines. Right? Because they take what exists, because that's what exists in the data, and they replicate that with incredible sophistication. And yet when we come to the world with the idea that we don't start equally, things are not necessarily fair, there are many kinds of inequalities that exist in the world, AI currently does not have an answer for us there because it does not have this sense of history. This is what we understand from history, and we're often lacking this historical dimension. And so that's why I think we were discussing in the prep for this call, sort of like thinking about how do we zoom out a little bit, zoom out maybe from the data and the training data, zoom out a little from the system even, and think about what are the structural inputs that are also affecting the kinds of AI and the kinds of systems that are developed right now. And I can name a couple, and then maybe you all can name some more that you're thinking of. So I mean, some of the things to me that I am thinking about is the organization of AI resources. So the organization specifically in a small number of very large corporations that have basically gone out and sort of stolen everybody's data, stuffed it into these giant models, and are currently competing in a kind of AI arms race for compute power. And there's like a big bet that's going on right now around how foundation models are sort of the very best solution out there. And I think for me, this structural organization leads to downstream impacts. That means, first of all, I'm not sure any of these data problems will ever get fixed. But I'm also not sure whose problems will be solved, who will get technology built for them if this is the current organization of resources, and especially if those resources are so incredibly expensive, both from a financial standpoint and an environmental standpoint. I think this leaves us with a lot of groups and a lot of potential use cases where technology will not be created. And it's specifically in relation to that problem. In my lab, we've started creating feminist AI from the ground up, which really means reconsidering the whole organization of the process. Because I would like to ask the audience, actually, who here had any democratic input into ChatGPT? Did anybody here participate in the development? Yeah, nobody's raising their hand. How strange. Okay, Megan. Megan raised two hands.
I didn't, but I think all of us did, because it's the greatest test of human intellectual property in history.
Well, right. But the important thing about this is we were not consulted. Yeah. And so this is one of the things that we're getting with this current organization of resources is a kind of theft, proprietary nature. All of us sort of participated without consent, which I think Margaret is going to speak more about. And so, this is, one of the most major issues, right, is thinking through, like, the current way that technology development is proceeding is extremely non-democratic, and I think it's really no accident that the same logics that have produced the AI that we are experiencing are the same logics that are currently in operation in the US that are tending towards authoritarianism and fascism and eugenics. We need to note these connections. And we need to think about how do we reorganize not just the inputs, but the entire process of development to be more democratic. So that would be my salvo. Yeah.
So yeah, and just defining the fact that, yeah, these are the stakeholders, right? These are the people who are currently building the systems. And so of course the systems are going to be built in a particular way because, who are the people building them? Yeah, Margaret, you brought up a really great point about, specifically on this data point of like consent, compensation, credit, because how do we think about that? This is all data that was supposedly free on the web, but what does that mean?
Right, yeah. I think Catherine is already explaining so much of this so well. I feel like I don't really have a lot I can add, but I mean, just this idea of sort of like what the structural inputs are speaks to all of the different kind of structures in play that influence what actually happens in terms of like data collection itself. And so I just sort of also wanted to highlight that a large part of this is also around consent and credit and compensation. And artists and creators are speaking up about this in particular, where like it might be the case that copyright law makes it possible for organizations to take this data and create systems from it. But that's copyright is distinct from individuals providing the actual consent to use that data. And so we actually have like a bit of a structural inequality here, or inequity, where the sort of law that's in place that arguably allows companies to use this data, I mean, this is like being discussed in courts, doesn't correspond to the actual stated desires of a lot of people creating the data, which is around either consenting, or ideally always consenting, and that's opt-in, not opt-out. So there's a lot more to say about opting in to having your data used versus opting out once it's already there. The current operating paradigm, if we're lucky, is opt-out, but even then, that's not really always available. So providing consent within an informed sort of situation where you can opt in directly to knowing how it will be used. Also, that requires the company knowing how the data will be used and like what the systems will be used for, which isn't defined. So that's consent. And then getting credit and compensation when your data is used. So, I mean, you can imagine, like, just as we have like influence functions, so people who work on like what bits of data are specifically relevant to the outputs of a machine learning model, we can also have information about who are the creators of that data, and should they be given compensation for the fact that that data they created in particular is being used, and should they be given credit? So like some of the data that's being slurped up in order to build these models have attribution licenses on them. So like Creative Commons licenses say you have to attribute if you're using this. If you're modifying this in some way, you still have to attribute me. And so you could imagine a paradigm where you're actually respecting those licenses and more fundamentally respecting the desires and the stated goals of creators. But instead, that's just been sort of swept under the rug, in the US with the hope of like, oh, this all counts as fair use. So legally it's okay. But that's distinct from what makes sense, like ethically, tied to human values, tied to what people are actually wanting.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll ask a question in a kind of a trolley problem sense, but usually when you run into a trolley problem in real life, you got to find an alternate, right? And so you might say that, you're kind of, when you have a group that hasn't been well represented, whether it's women or a particular racial group, I was D&I Cult chair for ICML, where we're talking about indigenous people and indigenous languages. You kind of are in this catch-22 of if you have your data go into the model, then some big company gets to use that data for whatever they feel like, but at least you're represented, right? Like you produce pictures with that group, you produced examples of language with that group. Or you decide to, if you create friction in the mechanism, or you decide that maybe I don't want my data included, then now you aren't exposed to the world anymore, right? You're hidden. And models will continue to not represent you. I work on healthcare applications, so this comes up a lot as well for various minority groups and wanting to do good predictions on those groups. So again, I'm presenting this as an either or, but usually answers are not either or. I'm curious what you all think.
I can jump
in.
Go ahead. I think this is very interesting, and it's very resonant with, I was at a really interesting conference in January, which included academic researchers who are thinking about generative AI and cultural inclusion. And it included many folks from industry, like Google and Microsoft and others who are working on this issue from that standpoint. And these were basically, there were these sort of two pathways. So there was like kind of one camp of people that was like, well, we need our enormous models to ingest more and more data from marginalized groups, whether that is indigenous folks or there was a person talking about ASL, American Sign Language, various kinds of gender minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and so on. And then there were folks pushing back on this, in particular from the Global South, to say why. Why do we have to give you all our data so that you can own it?
You've taken so many other things.
And and represent us back to us, usually in an extremely biased and imperfect way. And we actually had a lot of really interesting discussions around this. And one of the things that we ended up arriving to is it again comes back to some of these structural factors about the way that the development of AI is organized. Why do we not have a healthier information or AI ecosystem in which groups can develop and own and run their own computing infrastructure, own their own data, own their own servers, run their own models? Why is this not on the table as an option? Because ultimately this is what many indigenous groups are actually doing. If you look at the amazing work of the Maori, who rejected the corporate attempts to kind of come and feed, steal their data and feed it back to them through a model. So I think like that, I just want to put that as the question of like sort of how do we get to that organization of resources such that there is control, autonomy, self-determination. These are core sort of democratic values. But then at the same point, I think there will be applications, like the things that you're outlining, where it will need to make decisions about a wide variety of people within the population, and we need to work to reduce the harm and the bias in those kinds of models. And I think I do see that as a really important task, and it's not one that I see being taken, honestly, very seriously in industry, at least.
Absolutely. So let's take a couple minutes just to imagine, if we were asking the right questions, like what sort of tools would we be building? Like what will we be doing differently? This is a gender and AI event, so maybe related to gender, but it can be more broad as well. What are the questions that if the stakeholders were different? Yeah. What do you all think?
I'm curious what Margaret thinks, because I feel like she's so closely actually working on alternative models. So.
Yeah, I know there's a slight delay, so I'm like trying to make sure. Apologies. Yeah, well, first, I just kind of wanted to comment on this last point, because I want to just highlight a few things that I think sort of are really important for people to know. So one is that the topic that we're discussing there is around colonialism and algorithmic colonialism, data colonialism. And so the issue of like, why can't we have lots of people at the table making their own decisions for AI for everyone is in part because, these communities are often already subject to colonialism, dating back hundreds of years, where sort of like global North and white people are sort of dominating people in the global South, this sort of thing. And so that's just like being further perpetuated within AI. And so I think that's, it's really tricky to address that head on, because it involves grappling with hundreds of years of sort of oppression of these various people in various ways. And I just also kind of wanted to highlight, like, we had this question about, okay, maybe you are taking people's data without their desire for you to have it, but at least they're being included. And I just want to sort of highlight there that like this is one of the fundamental kind of problems that we deal with in ethics. So basically, there are a lot of different values in every decision, and you can't have something like all the values, and there's a lot of things that are in tension. And so when you're sort of making decisions about how to construct these systems, it's really useful to identify the different sort of values at play and then figure out how you want to prioritize among those. And so things like diversity and inclusion come up against exploitation, or I should say diversity comes up against exploitation. So if you're trying to optimize for diversity, we're going to have like a super diverse data set. Then without being intentional about inclusionary, participatory, democratic processes, as Catherine has been saying, you come up against exploitation. So it's really important to like lay out what are the specific values at play within these different decisions, and then make sure that you're hitting on them in a way that prioritizes really what you think should be, prioritized in the pursuit of better systems. And also to that point, like, if you have systems that are inclusive of people in some way, like because you have data that represents them, that isn't necessarily a good thing if the system is being used for oppression anyway, right? So like we saw this sort of issue with facial recognition, where like on the one hand, there was an argument that facial recognition should be improved for like Black women versus white men, where for white men it worked much better. But on the other hand, it's like, well, this is just being used to harm people, and it's being used by systems that are already trying to oppress people with this skin tone. So isn't even good that they're included. Like maybe we should just do away with the technology, as a whole. And so I think that's just like an important thing to keep in mind, that it's not always necessarily the case that having a more diverse system is better. And in fact, it can create even more problems, because it gets associated to like, oh, this is a mathematical system, and so it's correct, and so what we do with it is the right thing to do. And I think that just fundamentally misses the larger picture there of how these systems can be abused and misused to harm people, regardless of how diverse it is.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, did you want to add to that?
Just on the question of alternatives, I was going to offer an example.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, well, why don't you present us with an alternative, and then maybe we can do just a little bit of imagining, and then there's some questions coming in that I want to make sure we get to as well. So yeah, tell us about your alternative.
Sure, just on the question of like, how might it look? If it looked differently, what would it look like? I was just going to offer a very concrete example from what we've been doing in my lab. So we've been working in partnership with data activists and journalists transnationally, so across Latin America and North America, and now a handful in Africa. And we are working with groups that collect data on gender-based violence. And we modeled what I would call a feminist or just simply a democratic process of making machine learning and AI with these groups, we went to them and we said, should we do anything? Like, we have some skills. This is an interesting problem space. Should we build anything? And we decided to go forward, and we decided to build something. And then we said, well, okay, what should we build? We didn't necessarily say we have to do AI because it's so like cool right now. And we had it open because sometimes other tools are fit for purpose, right? It's not always necessarily AI. One tool did not involve AI. One tool that we built did involve AI. And then at that point, we're building a system that is trying to classify news articles as to whether they represent, describe a case of gender-based violence or not. And so the way that we trained the machine learning model to do this is we basically worked with the activists. We paid activists and journalists to annotate news articles so that it would teach the machine how to recognize those articles in the system. And then we deployed a model, and now the model can go out and recognize many more. On a daily basis, it goes out and surfaces articles for them. This is the information that they are interested already because of the work that they do. It surfaces many more articles to them than they would have been able to do in their very manual process that they were doing previously. In the pilot of this technology, we did a participatory pilot and learned that our models needed to be made more intersectional. We actually needed to design different models for racialized women. And that was a really important learning for us. We had to actually go back to the drawing board on that sense. And then we continued to support these tools and these groups and have a lot of dialogue and back and forth. But I just wanted to kind of propose this. This is a process that could be done with many different groups on many different issues. And this is not an impossible thing. It's just not where our collective investment and attention is placed, is on a kind of ethical and participatory process to actually address inequalities. And so I just want to offer that as this is one small alternative, and there are many others that are happening as well. And I think, again, I think it's important to try to think outside of the trap, which is that the trap is that what we're only offered by corporate AI. We are actually able to do many other things if we can kind of expand our thinking of what is possible, who we're working with, and what a participatory process might look like. And if we also open up a little bit these ideas that all we are prioritizing is scale and generalization and abstraction. I actually think those are very harmful norms to be bringing to the table if what we're talking about is addressing key problems like, say, inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality, or what have you.
Yeah, and add to that just profit, right?
Profit.
Yes, plain and simple. I want to, and if people have questions, please post them. I want to just also, make it just mundane for us. People ask me ooh, AI, all this stuff is happening. How is life going to be completely different in 3 years? And I'm like, I don't know if my life is going to be that different in 3 years. I'm going to be doing the dishes. I'm going to be finding the socks under my children's beds. And in terms of what AI can do, will there be an AI that coordinates all of the different platforms for me to make coordinated doctor's appointments and get the kids' physicals to the summer camp in time? Is that going to be someone's priority? I'm not sure, right? In terms of what AI is building. Could it do that? Yes. Will it do that? I don't, I'm unconvinced. When we're thinking about problems that could be solved, in terms of promise, what's on your minds? There's these global scale things that we talked about, but just, every day, if we think about gender, are there sets of problems that we're just missing because they are not, they're not checking all those boxes, right? In terms of abstraction, generalization, profit.
Yeah, I would love to speak to that. So I've worked a lot on accessibility, and it's always just blown my mind that so many people will motivate their technology as being good for people to benefit humanity and even bring in accessibility as something that would be a really clear use case of it, and yet not actually build from the beginning with accessibility, in mind. So I'm talking about, providing information for blind and low vision people to be able to navigate the world without needing, additional assistance, stuff that provides information about what's being said for people who are deaf, this sort of thing. And also like the aging and elderly as well, they are completely marginalized in technology development. Technology is not developed at all with people who are more senior in mind, who haven't grown up with technology. And so the way that technology is being developed right now is sort of treating accessibility and helping others who could really be used by, or who could really benefit from technology as an afterthought, as a post hoc. Like after we've developed this technology, then we can think about these use cases that could actually benefit people. But we have another way that we can develop, which is to say, what are the best use cases that people actually need right now to level the playing field, to be able to get done what they want to get done, and build technology in light of that. So this accessibility, this augmentative kind of approach, and that's essentially absent from modern development in large corporations now.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to offer, I think this point is so important about like, who does the design or the development start with? And it's always that like middle percentage of some like, what I've called
the median human.
Yeah, the median human, the default body, which is always like a white man, middle-aged body, cisgender.
Or in our world, who's the replaceable body, so that the companies can, take out that worker.
Yeah. But then what I was going to offer from like the standpoint of like where we could be looking, we've been looking a lot at gender-related violence. And I think that's really interesting. And again, it would not be something a corporation would ever look at because what's the profit? Another area that we've been looking at in terms of innovation, asymmetry in my lab, we've been looking a lot at housing technologies. And there's this huge asymmetry in who's getting technology and AI in this sort of property technology realm. It's the landlords. And in fact, if we look at, there's tons of things for them. There's credit, there's tenant screening algorithms. There's all sorts of smart systems for accessing homes. There's all sorts of algorithmic property management tools. What about tenants? And this is actually a gendered issue, right? Because women are disproportionately renters. The folks that are most harmed by evictions are traditionally single women of color. And so, like, what about the tenants? Where are the technologies that are helping tenants build power and work towards housing security? Those are not being built. And so, think about these areas. Another area I was really excited to hear, there's folks that are going to be representing it, is women's health. Again, a like super overlooked area of research and technology development. So I think these are spaces that we can be looking at, but I said 3. I think there's probably like 10 million other ones that, again, will not be developed by corporations because of the profit incentive and because of the shareholder structure. They're accountable to shareholders. They're not accountable to us.
And there's a number of questions that are coming in from people around the room who are just like, so how do we create these more decentralized ways of creating technologies as an everyday person? How can I, be part of creating tools that are useful for me or advocating for tools that are useful for other groups? Like, what advice do you have for people in this room who are like, yeah, we want that world. We want the world that you two are describing.
Well, I can just sort of speak to one sort of mode, which is having more open code that can be developed on directly. So I've worked in closed companies like Google and Microsoft, which have good reason to keep stuff sort of obfuscated. And I'm now currently working at Hugging Face, which is an open source company. And one of the things that does is it creates more collaborative and democratic processes. So like, you don't have to be associated to a technology corporation at all to work on technology that is important for you and for people you love. And so we've seen like lots of really cool initiatives and projects come out of the open source and sort of open code space. So like Seattle, for example, just had a big increase in work on accessibility of sidewalks, where people used open source code in order to figure out how you can have specific routes through Seattle that cater to different kinds of accessibility needs. That was done by the University of Washington primarily. But essentially, it's very, very useful to know how to code. Although I suppose at the start we were sort of speaking to, you're not actually needing to know how to code as much anymore because like the AI does it for you, but you need to be able to know what the AI is doing in the first place to know if it's correct. So I will say that like openness in sharing technology and then being able to iterate on it, develop further, interact about what's good and what's bad, and then build coalitions. So this is another really cool thing we see in the open source community is that people tend to build sort of groups of collaborative people, this sort of coalition building, which is such a fundamental and important part of democracy, in order to create really useful technology. So that's one avenue that I've been specifically working on that I find to be pretty valuable towards these kinds of goals.
I feel like this is so important, and it's something that we really lack is exactly this like open source ecosystem around these tools and technologies. And so I feel like that is such a huge, important area to push, and also to figure out, frankly, how to finance, because again of the kind of extreme compute that is necessary for some of these models, that is a very anti-democratic way of organizing resources. So thinking too about how do we shift that so that more people can participate in this open ecosystem in a more democratic way. And then the other thing that I was going to offer is, as we think about alternative models, my whole life, the way that I have worked, is I've worked to build the future that I want to see on a small scale or in a temporary way. And that's something that we can all do right here and right now. And so like, I can't necessarily, let's say, tax the hell out of Google and dismantle it and like redistribute all the resources to other people and like totally transform that ecosystem. That's not within my power. But it is within my power right now from the position that I'm in to build deeply participatory, collaborative, feminist AI tools. Like I can do that. I can model that. That becomes a model and a blueprint that others can follow in other domains, and we can share about that. In other spaces where I've worked on women's health, we've modeled a world that is welcoming and beautiful for breastfeeding and postpartum people and babies, and we did it on the scale of a weekend, and it existed. It was a beautiful space on the scale of a weekend, and then it went away. But during that one weekend time, it gave us a lot of hope that this is a world that is possible. And so I would encourage us to kind of hold on to that, even though the moment right now is the moment's very dark, but we can do very small things from whatever our place of agency is to bring those worlds into being. And so I would encourage all of us to think about that and then start to build those things with others.
That's such an important sentiment, because I don't think we can do something that we haven't experienced, even if it's on a small scale or in a small moment. But once you create that experience, you kind of create the feeling, the momentum of what you need to continue. There's questions also about just like expertise in here. That like if you have if you have an idea of like this would make my life better, or this would make someone else's life better. But Margaret, for example, you mentioned, these systems need to be coded, right? GPT, your favorite LLM, will help you write your code, but you still kind of have to know how to babysit a large language model. Like how do we think about that question as well, about like needing experts to create these models? So you need compute, as you said, but you also need a certain type of expertise.
I guess that's maybe to me. So I think this actually kind of goes to the gender thing a little bit. So I'm a computer scientist. I went from being called a linguist when I worked on natural language processing to being called an ethicist when I worked on ethics. But I'm rarely ever called a computer scientist, which was like what I actually have my PhD in, because people just have these mental models of what people look like who have different kinds of occupations or who have different kinds of passions. And I think that part of sort of my aha moment when I was younger as a woman was my mom used to say, don't be scared of getting your hands dirty with math. And that really like clicked with me, where I realized that I had this vision of myself that didn't actually correspond to what I was interested in, but did correspond to sort of like gendered norms of how women should be. And that ended up with me thinking that I was bad at math or couldn't do programming, even though I was like much better in those subjects than I was at more like traditional feminine or assigned to sort of like female gender sort of foci, so like languages and this kind of thing. And so I think it is actually like really important that even if computer science seems scary or messy or complicated, like don't be afraid to get your hands dirty with it. Because once you're in there, it's super fun. And so, you know, there are these barriers that tell us like, don't do this, like this is not me. But I think it's really important to recognize like, yeah, it is you. And you can do it. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, totally. And I think this idea that the barriers are not as high as they used to be, I think is also like these tools, on one hand, they might seem really big and scary in terms of everything that they're doing out in the world. But in terms of assistance to create whatever your vision is, frankly, I find it, I had to learn 13 different languages in the undergrad. I learned them all badly because I'm terrible at syntax. And now I don't have to remember, like, is it a freaking comma or semicolon or parentheses? You know, these. So maybe we do have opportunities. So there's a question kind of related to that, or a couple questions. Basically, you know, okay, you need compute. You need to be able to write some technical code or create some technical object. In general, there's like a funding question of like, how do you pay for these sorts of things? And then especially in our current political context. And maybe just one more time, just thinking, like sharing, like, okay, on small scale, like what is possible? Because I think on one hand, it is true, like all of these things that I've said, you know, that people are pointing out are absolutely true. On the other hand, we are in this moment that perhaps it is easier than ever to create stuff than it has been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just also on the last point, I'll say that I worked as a programmer, software developer, and a database programmer for like 10 or 15 years, and I experienced very similar things. Of like, I was once told directly by a CEO who was maybe going to hire me during a job interview that I don't look like a programmer. So he didn't know what the programmers would think of me. And I got the job, so I guess they thought I was a programmer because I was a programmer. But I hope you're right, and I hope that the things are changing because that was a while ago. Yeah, and I was just going to say, yeah, I think I mean, maybe again I'll come back to hope, but maybe also a message of sort of stay the course. I mean, I think one of the strategic communications things that is happening, at least in the U.S. context right now, with all the attacks on DEI, the whitewashing of U.S. history, the anti-Semitic comments and Nazi salutes at the inauguration, like all of this sort of crazy stuff. It's designed to spread fear, and it's designed to silence us, and it's designed to make us shift what we are doing to other directions for various reasons, for reasons of funding or whatever it might be. But I want to just note that, like that, while they want you to think that takeover is complete, it is very incomplete. And for example, I just got an NSF project funded just this week, and it has so many of the censored words in it. I was like, well, this is cool, because this means that the takeover is not complete. It is not a done deal, you all. I also am mentoring an Indigenous undergraduate student who she had an amazing project about studying Indigenous water systems, and she got funded on the NSF GRFP. And I'm thrilled for her. And she, again, has many words like marginalized and historic and women and stuff like this that we are supposedly not supposed to talk about anymore. And so I think, like, you know, one of my messages here would be, like, stay the course. There are so many of us out here who I think do care about equality, who care about democracy, and I include lots of men and then lots of white men in that statement. There are so many of us that like we can create many things right now, and we can stay that course and go into the future in that way. So yeah, I think like just don't believe the hype of the takeover. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And now switching to a slightly different topic, there's a couple of questions that have to do with, what skills do we want to maintain, as these tools now, outside of like a, political structure or something like that. But if we're defining the problems that we want to solve, are we going to be losing key parts of ourselves, key skills by building tools? Is the focus on kind of like text and I guess images in these models taking away from all the things that kind of go with, being embodied people, caregiving space, like things that, as I mentioned before this particular question came in, doing the dishes and finding the socks, so like how do we see like AI being integrated again into these like everyday spaces in a way that enriches us, and doesn't take away from our human experience, but also doesn't, de-skill us. Think about the question in any way you want, but there's a theme around like what are we keeping, what problems are being solved here.
I mean, I think maybe one thing I'd uplift, and then turn it to Margaret, but one thing I'd uplift maybe that resonates with some of the themes from last night is that I actually do think there's a whole feminist ethics of care that can be brought to the development of AI and to the development of technology. And I think we saw that last night, and then I would say also in the work with these citizen data scientists and data journalists and data activists, there's this amazing care and carefulness that these organizations engage in as they construct a data set. And so I don't necessarily think that all of our technologies are these just pure efficiency machines, or purely just to take things away from our decision making. And actually this came up as a key tension when we were building the technology with these activist groups. We actually our technical team suggested, hey, we could automate this more for you. Like we could scoop up all these news articles and like put them into a spreadsheet, and we could try to automatically like classify them. And they slowed us down. And again, they slowed us down, and we were able to slow down, and we were able to make a different decision because we were in dialogue. And they said no. Like actually, the key part of what we do when we collect cases of violence against women is we are human witnesses to that violence. And so to automate that would be to bypass the almost like sort of spiritual emotional labor that saw themselves engaging in. And that was a really interesting insight. Like we would not have expected that. And the only reason that we were able to learn that is because we were in dialogue with these groups. And so I think there's a way, and so we didn't do that. We didn't go that route. It automates to a certain point, and then it leaves the decision and the kind of information extraction tasks it leaves to the activists. And so I think there's ways in which the development of the technology can be embodied and can be about care, and it can be about caring for a community because it's caring about the sort of knowledge keeping about that community. So that's that. I just want to offer that one.
Yeah. There's another question that that asks specifically for you, Catherine, but Margaret, jump in as well. Are we doing ourselves a disservice by calling democratic projects non-profitable? Are these two things necessarily in tension, like profits versus democracy? Like how do we frame that and think about that?
Yeah, I don't think, not necessarily. I mean, I think there can be a business case. Like, for example, I think there's a huge business case for things related to women's health. you know, because we actually are talking about like the health of like half of the population. So like, so things like this, I do think there are certain points where, let's say, democracy and capitalism or business use or profit, I think there are cases where those things can align. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But my question is, what happens when they don't align? And because I think many of the things that relate to inequality are literally not profitable to solve. They are byproducts of a free market capitalist system that's how it works by design. It's designed to produce those kinds of gendered and racialized hierarchies. Also aged hierarchies. I thought it was interesting to hear Margaret talking about older people as well. And so how do we, in a very capitalist society, how do we take care of our young, our old, our marginalized by whatever means, the poor? Those are things capitalism doesn't do for us. Corporations don't do that work for us. They will never do that work for us. So that's why we need democracy. Democracy should do that work.
And maybe it's also like I'm a reinforcement learning person, I think, in terms of short and long-term thinking, right? There's a short-sightedness that maybe it's good to take care of the kids because they will become the workers, or it's good to take care of the old people because you will also be old one day, right? But we're not thinking along those lines, right? Well, we're about at time. So first of all, I just want to thank both of you, Margaret and Catherine, for this amazing discussion, and just leave us in the room, again, hopefully with this broader picture of, it's not just, when we think about inputs to these systems, it's not just about the data that go into the systems, it's everything around that. Who was at the table, who defined the problems, and we can be part of that, right, in small and maybe temporary ways. I really liked that analogy again of creating those experiences. On one hand, we do live in difficult times, and on the other hand, we live in times where it is possible for small groups and individuals to create those experiences at small scale and to bubble that up into larger and larger into forces. So thanks again, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks, Margaret.
And thank you, Finale, for moderating. I knew you all would get us set the tone in a really powerful way. I loved how concrete you made all of this, and I love the message of hope and agency, because I think it's very real. All right, so now we get to enjoy a very brief break. Please help yourselves. There is a break here until 10:25. We will resume promptly at 10:25, so please be back. Thank you.